Welcome back. We're talking about the environmental impact of animal agriculture. Joining us from San Francisco is environmental attorney, livestock rancher, and writer Nicolette Hahn Niman. Her latest book is called Defending Beef, The Case for Sustainable Meat Production. And with us from Sacramento is University of California Davis professor Frank Mitloehner. He chairs a UN project on the environmental footprint of livestock production. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Nicolette, we've just been talking with Kip Anderson, who's the producer of that movie called Cowspiracy, which says, in essence, that the biggest culprit when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions is not fossil fuels, as we normally hear, but meat and dairy farming. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I've seen the film, and it's a vegan advocacy piece, but it is not an environmentally sound film. I can say from having worked professionally full-time for several years on this issue, that how livestock are raised, where and how and in what numbers, is the key question. When they're raised well, in the right way, they are actually ecologically essential. So I think the whole premise of the film is just wrong.
When you say ecologically essential, do they contribute in any way to greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, it's an interesting question because there has been a lot of research measuring their emissions, but there's actually a whole new line of research now showing that, for example, the grazing animals contribute in a very significant way to the sequestration of carbon in the soils. And there's even a substantial body of evidence from Australia and India showing that where you have well-managed grazing systems, there are very high levels of methane oxidizing bacteria. They're referred to as methanotrophs or MOBs, MOBs. And so the research really hasn't been looking at the whole picture until very recently. And when you look at the picture more systemically, there's actually no reason to believe that cattle are inherently an environmental problem, even from a greenhouse gas perspective.
Okay, Frank, if we look at some of the main points of that documentary, saying that animal farming is responsible for more than half of greenhouse gas emissions, that farming animals consumes nearly a third of the planet's drinking water, and animals occupy something like 45% of Earth land. What do you make of the science behind all those arguments?
Well, simply said, there is no science behind it. Conspiracy is misleading and flawed, and I tell you why. In the United States, all of livestock and feed, assessed as in a very comprehensive way, contributes around 4% of all greenhouse gases. Transportation, about a quarter of all greenhouse gases. Energy production use 30% of all greenhouse gases. And that can be found in the emission inventory of the Environmental Protection Agency of this country. I confirmed those numbers through research in my lab and throughout the scientific literature. Where the Cowspiracy gets their number from is an organization called the World Watch Institute claiming that livestock contributes to 51% of all greenhouse gases. And here is why that claim is totally inaccurate. Methane is approximately 25 times more potent than CO2, and that's appreciated by all throughout the scientific community. Cowspiracy and the World Watch Institute claim that methane is not 25 times more potent, but 71 times more potent. And by changing those numbers, by basically whipping those data until they confess, they come up with this very high number of 51% of all greenhouse gases coming from livestock. Again, in the United States, it's almost 4%. Worldwide, all of livestock contributes to 14%. In my perspective, this discussion is leading us to a wrong path for solutions.
Okay, Nicolette, I want you to take a listen to what one of the scientists in that film says in the documentary on raising animals. Let's watch this.
It takes 23 months for a grass-fed animal to grow to the point, to the size and age that it's slaughtered, whereas a grain-fed takes 15 months. So that's an additional 8 months of water use, land use, feed, waste. And in terms of a carbon footprint, it's a huge difference.
Turns out, due to land use, grass-fed beef is more unsustainable than even factory farming.
So, Nicolette, the conventional view is that eating grass-fed beef is better for us. But now, listening to that, is it worse for us because it's taking longer for the animal to reach a stage where it can be used if it's fed grains, therefore using more land, therefore emitting more gases. That turns the whole argument on its head, doesn't it?
No, because once again, this film is taking a very narrow view of the issue and only looking at one side of the question. That film and much of the anti-meat propaganda that's out there today is ignoring all of the beneficial aspects. So in my book, Defending Beef, I go through a very detailed analysis of why having grazing animals on open lands are incredibly important for the environment. They provide protection to the water resources. Basically, the soils are healthier when you have that animal impact and where you have the vegetative cover. And if you don't have that vegetative cover, such as in crop production, you actually have much greater environmental impacts in terms of soil losses, in terms of water pollution, in terms of all different kinds of environmental impacts. So when you actually consider the positive side of having those animals present, and I mentioned carbon sequestration before, having the animals longer on grasses is actually beneficial.
What about the other argument he makes, Nicolette, that in many instances rainforests are being destroyed to make way for land which could be used by animals, and in that way the earth is being hurt because of the destruction of these forests?
There is obviously some truth to that. There have been areas of the world where deforestation has taken place for various different human purposes, and in a lot of cases livestock are involved. But actually in the Amazon, it should be noted that the figure used in that film is from 1994. It's more than 20 years old, and actually in the Amazon, according to a recent report by several nonprofit organizations, deforestation has declined dramatically, 83% over the last decade. And basically, deforestation shouldn't be happening for livestock production. Where that's happening, that needs to be addressed. But there's nothing inherently about raising animals or raising grazing animals, especially cattle, that in any way causes deforestation. That's a policy, land use policy, that needs to be fixed. And Brazil, for example, is very aggressively doing that. And so that whole issue has almost disappeared in the country of Brazil.
I totally agree with what I just heard. I feel that countries like Brazil do have a relatively high carbon footprint associated with their beef production, which they could shrink dramatically by going the route that we have gone here in the United States. I just wanted to throw in one number, and that is that 70% of the land used in the United States for beef production is on non-arable land, meaning the land that these animals are grazing on could not be used for crop production because it either doesn't have enough rainfall or it doesn't have good enough soil properties. So 70% of that land used for beef could not be used for any other purpose.
But in any case, we would need rainforests, wouldn't we?
I think we do need rainforests, and we do need to keep rainforests, and wherever humans clear-cut rainforest, whether it's for livestock or for palm oil or other issues, we need to stop that.
But can I add another point here?
Sure, go ahead.
There's a really important point here as well. This film and a lot of this vegan advocacy has been directed at American consumers. And actually in the United States, we are reforesting. There's no deforestation taking place in the United States. And there's almost no beef coming into the United States from the Amazonian areas that are being deforested. So it's really misleading to tell American consumers that if they reduce their beef consumption, that's going to somehow help this problem. That's actually not true at all. In fact, the opposite might be true, because when you are buying American beef, you're buying something that is not coming from one of those areas. You're supporting the alternative.
Frank, you chair the UN project on the environmental footprint of livestock production, as we mentioned in the introduction to this part of the show. Are there any findings so far that you could tell us about?
Yes. Well, first of all, what was a real problem in the past was that every interest group throughout the world picked a methodology to quantify livestock emissions that fit their purposes best. For example, Cowspiracy picked one that made livestock look really poorly, 51% of total contributions. Globally, we have now arrived at one way of quantifying environmental footprint of livestock. That's one methodology, and if that methodology is used correctly, then it will show that there is a vast difference in the environmental footprint of livestock in different regions in the world. And one of the things that we have found so far is that the complete impact livestock has on the environment is the lowest across any parts of the world here in the United States. And the reason for that is that we are modern, that we are efficient. We have mastered that particular issue of livestock production like nobody else in the world.
Nicolette, your book is called Defending Beef, the Case for Sustainable Meat Production. Briefly, make that case to us.
Basically, the world was once covered by large herds of grazing animals. There were vast grasslands for tens of millions of years, and the grazing animals played an absolutely essential role in those grassland ecosystems. Today, about 99% of the wild animals have disappeared because of human activity as well as climatic changes. And you actually need grazing animals in those areas to have those ecosystems function properly. And it really all goes back down to the soil biology. Where you have the animal impact, you have good soil biology. And good soil biology means more vegetative growth. It means that the energy from the sun can be captured in those plants and fed into the soils. And that sequesters carbons, that protects the water supply, because when you have a vegetative cover and you have healthy soils, that filters the rainwater. It protects the soils from eroding and running away and from other contaminants getting into the water supply. And so basically, having those domesticated animals, especially the grazing animals, are absolutely essential to protecting the whole ecosystem of the world.
Frank, we just had a major global climate change conference which took place in Paris. There was an agreement signed at the end of it. Was animal agriculture discussed at all at that conference?
It was discussed, but only to a very small extent. And the reason for this is that by far the leading source of greenhouse gases throughout the world is the use of fossil fuel. Again, very much in contrary to what Cowspiracy propagates. It is the use of fossil fuel. And what this really means is that carbon, pure carbon that had been stored in the ground for hundreds of millions of years in form of oil, coal, and gas, has been taken out of the ground for the last 60 years or so. About half of it has been taken out. We have burned it, and now these carbon molecules are in the air. And whenever the sun hits those carbon molecules, they heat up. And so the world now understands that and has basically agreed to decarbonize their industries over the next half century or so. And that is a milestone in reducing greenhouse gases throughout the world that I don't think everybody understands, is just fundamental.
I was just going to add, there was also, for the first time, there was a lot of attention paid in these conversations in Paris to the role of soils and the incredible importance that recapturing carbon into the soils will play for addressing climate change. And the grazing animals are an essential part of that.